Priya buys a house. Diego rents the same kind of house and invests the difference. They both think they made the smarter move. Let's actually run the numbers over 20 years and see who's right. Same starting point for both. $400,000 in the housing market they're both looking at. $85,000 a year income. Same city, same age, same savings. $60,000 in the bank. Day 1. Priya buys a $400,000 house. 15% down. $60,000 plus closing costs of about $10,000. So she's actually out $70,000 to get in the door. She takes a 30-year mortgage at 6.5% on the remaining $340,000. Monthly principal and interest, about $2,150. Add property tax and insurance, and her total monthly housing cost is around $2,700. Diego rents a comparable house for $2,200 a month. He didn't have $70,000 to put down, so he keeps his $60,000 and invests it in a total stock market index fund. Plus, he sets up a monthly contribution of $500, funded partly by the $500 gap between what Priya pays and what he pays in housing costs every month. Priya has keys, a mortgage statement, and something to show for her money immediately. Diego has a lease and a brokerage account. Everyone at the barbecue is more impressed by Priya. Nobody's throwing a party because their friend opened an index fund account. Quick note on the assumptions here, since they matter for everything that follows. Home appreciation of 3% a year is a reasonable long-term average, not a promise. Some years it's flat, some years it's 8%, some years, rarely, it's negative. The 9% stock return is also a long-term historical average for a total market index fund, not a guarantee for any specific year. Both of these numbers will bounce around wildly year to year in real life. We're using smoothed averages here specifically to compare the two pairs fairly over a long timeline, not to predict exactly what either of them would experience in any single year. Year 1 reality. Priya's mortgage payment barely moves the needle on principal in year 1. Most of that, $2,150, is interest at this point in a 30-year loan. Maybe $250 a month actually goes toward the balance. She also spends $1,800 fixing a water heater that died in month 8, and $600 on a plumber for a slow leak nobody caught during inspection. Diego's $60,000 grows to roughly $65,000 at a 9% return. His monthly contributions add another $6,000. End of year 1, he's sitting around $71,000. No repairs, no surprising plumbing bills, no calls from anyone. Priya's house has appreciated maybe 3% in a normal market, so it's worth around $412,000 now. Her equity, what the house is worth minus what she owes, is roughly $75,000, counting both the appreciation and the small amount of principal she's paid down. Close, but Priya's already spent $2,400 in unplanned repairs that don't show up in any equity number. The real cost of owning, year by year. Here's what most rent versus buy comparisons skip completely, and it's the whole reason this comparison gets misleading. A mortgage payment isn't the cost of owning a home. It's part of the cost. Property tax and insurance run separately, and they go up most years, not down. Insurance specifically has been climbing faster than general inflation in a lot of markets over the last several years. So a number that felt reasonable at purchase can feel meaningfully heavier 5 years in, with no warning and nothing you did wrong. Maintenance is the standard rule of 1 to 2% of the home's value annually. On a $400,000 house, that's $4,000 to $8,000 a year. Some years it's a $150 fix, some years an $8,000 roof repair you can't put off. Then there's the stuff that hits in chunks. Roofs every 20 to 25 years, HVAC every 15 to 20, water heaters every 10 to 12. These aren't maybes, they're guaranteed future bills, and if you're not setting money aside monthly for them, you're not budgeting. You're gambling on timing. None of this shows up in, my mortgage is $2,150 a month. It shows up eventually, in a bill you didn't plan for, usually at the worst possible moment, because that's when things tend to break. Diego pays none of this. His landlord absorbs every repair, every roof, every furnace. His only cost is rent, which rises with the market but never hits him with a surprise $8,000 bill in August. That's a real quantifiable advantage of renting that almost never gets its own line item in these comparisons. even though it's one of the biggest practical differences between the two paths. By year 5, Priya's dealt with the water heater, a $3,200 driveway repair, and one HVAC repair that ran $1,100. Total unplanned costs over 5 years, around $9,500 on top of her regular mortgage payments. Her house is worth roughly $460,000 now. Mortgage balance is down to about $315,000. Equity around $145,000. Diego's portfolio, growing at 9% with his $500 monthly contribution the whole time, is sitting around $145,000 to $155,000 too. He's put in his original $60,000 plus $30,000 in contributions, $90,000 total. The rest is growth. He still hasn't fixed a single water heater. At year 5, they're basically tied, but Priya's tie came with $9,500 in surprise costs and a decent number of stressful phone calls to contractors. Diego's came with nothing but a monthly automatic transfer he doesn't think about. Where buying actually pulls ahead: leverage. Here's the piece that changes everything from here forward, and it's the real argument for owning. Priya put down $70,000 to control a $400,000 asset. That's leverage. She benefits from appreciation on the entire $400,000, not just her $70,000. When the house goes up 3% in a year, that's a $12,000 gain on a $70,000 investment, which is over 17% return on her actual cash, even though the house itself only grew 3%. Diego doesn't get this. His $500 a month buys exactly $500 of index fund, no leverage, no multiplier. This is the single biggest structural advantage owning has over renting and investing. And it's the real reason real estate builds wealth for a lot of people, even when the annual appreciation rate looks modest. But leverage cuts both ways. And this is the part that gets left out whenever someone's excited about it. If the housing market dips instead of rising, that same leverage magnifies the loss of Priya's actual cash just as hard as it magnified the gain. A 5% drop in home value is a much bigger hit to her $70,000 down payment than it is to the total value of the house. Diego's index fund can drop hard too, sometimes 30% plus in a bad year. But he's never one bad year away from owing more than his asset is worth. The way an over-leveraged homeowner can be if prices fall enough in a short window. By year 10, Priya's house is worth roughly $535,000. Mortgage balance is down to about $280,000. Equity around $255,000. Over the decade, she spent close to $22,000 in repairs and unplanned maintenance beyond her regular payments, plus routine costs like a repainted exterior and new flooring in 2 rooms. Diego's portfolio, same 9% average return, same $500 monthly contribution the whole time, is sitting around $290,000 to $310,000. Contributions total $150,000 over the decade. The rest, over $150,000, is pure compounding he never had to think about. At year 10, Diego's actually ahead, by a real margin. The leverage advantage Priya has is real, but it's not enough yet to overcome a decade of maintenance costs and a mortgage that's still mostly paying down slowly. Worth noting here, Priya's also been building something Diego hasn't, which is forced savings. Every mortgage payment she makes puts a little more into her own pocket in the form of equity, whether she feels like saving that month or not. Diego's $500 monthly contribution is voluntary, and voluntary savings are the first thing that gets skipped when life gets expensive. If Diego's discipline ever wavers over a decade, his numbers get worse. Priya's forced structure doesn't have that same failure point, which is a real, if unglamorous, advantage of a mortgage that rarely gets credit. By year 20, this is where it separates for good. Priya's house, appreciating around 3% a year, is worth roughly $720,000. Her mortgage is close to paid off, maybe $60,000 left. Equity around $660,000. Over 20 years, she's put roughly $45,000 to $55,000 into unplanned repairs and major capital costs. A full roof replacement somewhere in there, an HVAC swap, a water heater or 2. Diego's portfolio, same contribution and return rate the entire time, has grown to roughly $650,000 to $700,000. His total money in is $60,000 plus $120,000 in contributions, $180,000 total. The other $470 plus is pure growth. Run it side by side. Priya, roughly $660,000 in equity locked inside one house in one city, only accessible by selling or borrowing against it. Diego, roughly $650,000 to $700,000 fully liquid, sitting in an account he could turn into cash in a few days if he needed to. They land in almost the same place, but how they got there and what they're holding at the end is completely different. What the final numbers actually mean. Priya's number is bigger on paper in a lot of scenarios once you factor in that she also stopped paying anyone rent for the last chunk of those 20 years. Once the mortgage is paid off, her monthly housing cost drops to just tax, insurance, and maintenance, while Diego is still paying market rent every single month, which by year 20 has probably climbed well past what he started at. That's the piece that tips this in Priya's favor if you run it long enough. Rent doesn't stay $2,200 for 20 years. If it grows even modestly 3% a year, Diego's paying close to $4,000 a month by year 20, forever, with no end date. Priya's housing cost, once the mortgage is gone, might be $600 to $800 a month in tax, insurance, and upkeep. That gap, extended for the rest of both their lives, is where owning usually wins in the truly long run. Not at year 30, not even cleanly at year 20, but past that point as rent keeps climbing and Priya's fixed costs don't. Push this out to year 30, past the point the mortgage is fully paid off. Diego, if rent kept climbing at that same 3%, could be paying somewhere around $5,300 a month just to keep living in the same kind of home. Priya's paying a few $100s in tax and upkeep, and nothing else, because the loan that used to be $2,150 a month simply doesn't exist anymore. That's the real long game argument for owning. Not the equity number, which can genuinely go either way depending on the decade you retire into. But the fact that one person's housing cost has a ceiling that eventually drops to near zero, and the other person's doesn't. When renting and investing actually wins. If you move every few years, buying rarely makes sense. Closing costs and realtor fees alone, typically 8 to 10% combined between buying and selling, can eat an equity gained in a short window. Someone who buys and sells within 3 to 4 years often comes out behind purely on transaction costs, regardless of how the housing market performed during that stretch. If the rent-to-price ratio in your market is low, meaning rent is well under what a mortgage on a similar home would cost, renting and investing the difference can outperform owning for a very long time, sometimes indefinitely. This happens in a lot of expensive coastal markets, specifically where home prices have run well ahead of what local rents would justify. Buying in those markets can mean paying a big premium for the emotional and long-term benefits of ownership, not because the monthly math favors it. And if home maintenance genuinely isn't something you want to deal with ever, that has a real cost too. One that's harder to put a dollar figure on but is completely legitimate. Not everyone wants to be the one calling a plumber at 9 p.m. or managing a roofing contractor. That's a real preference, not a financial failure. And it's a completely valid reason to rent, even in a market where buying would technically come out ahead on paper. When buying actually wins. If you're staying put for 10 plus years, in a market where rent is close to or above what a mortgage payment would cost, leverage plus eventually fixed housing costs usually pulls ahead of renting and investing over the true long haul. The math especially favors buying if you can put a reasonable amount down without draining your entire emergency fund. And if you genuinely have the temperament to handle a surprise $6,000 repair without panicking or going into high-interest debt over it. Buying also wins more decisively if you're able to put down a bigger percentage up front, since that reduces how much interest you're paying the bank over the life of the loan. And it wins if you can lock in a rate during a period when mortgage rates are reasonably low relative to history, since that rate is fixed for the life of the loan regardless of what happens to rates afterward. Someone who bought during a period of historically low rates and never refinanced away from them holds a real quantifiable advantage over someone buying the identical house today at a meaningfully higher rate. The actual point. Neither of these people made a mistake. Priya built real, substantial equity and eventually escaped rent increases entirely. Diego built a fully liquid portfolio with zero maintenance stress and the flexibility to move anywhere, anytime, without selling a house first. The real trap isn't choosing renting or buying. It's choosing either one based on a general rule someone gave you without running your specific numbers. Your market's rent-to-price ratio, how long you're actually staying, what your emergency fund looks like, and whether you'd rather have a bigger illiquid number or a smaller liquid one. Run your own numbers before you decide which one wins for you. The answer's different depending on your city, your timeline, and your tolerance for a surprise plumbing bill at the worst possible time.